President Trump heading to Alaska today. You're looking at a live shot of Air Force One getting ready to take off. Bring the president along with a host of members of the cabinet, including Marco Rubio and others. Lutnick is on the list. Scott Bessent's on the list, and they will be meeting with Russian President Putin later today. Of course, they'll make up time in the air as the time difference helps them. For a look at what's on the agenda, want to bring in counsel on foreign relations, President Emeritus Richard Haass. He's now a senior counselor with Centerview Partners. It's good to see you. We saw each other just a week ago out in Aspen at that economic group's gathering, and it was fascinating. I'm curious, Richard, in terms of how this conversation goes, how much of it will ultimately be about Ukraine, and how much of it turns into a discussion about so many other sort of geopolitical chess pieces, if you will, the relationship between India and Russia, China and Russia, business issues, et cetera?
I think it would be best if it were mostly or exclusively about Ukraine, because I worry about linkages and trade-offs. But you just described the American delegation. If you have the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Treasury, that obviously suggests a broader agenda. The principal arms control agreement between the United States and Russia is due to expire in about half a year. That's a big issue. And then again, you've got any number of potential economic issues that could be put on the table. So again, my preference would be to keep it narrow, but my sense is it's going to go broad.
So if it goes broad and you get into this trade-off scenario that you're describing, sort of play out the permutations with which that conversation takes place, and to the degree you think that they can walk out of there and claim success, what that looks like.
Well, the danger is, let's take a step back. Some might say the opportunity is President Trump is conducting a foreign policy where across the board, Andrew, I think it's fair to say that economic issues have a degree of primacy that we haven't seen in recent history. So imagine the Russians were to put on the table certain economic benefits to the United States, exports, say, of rare earths or something like that, or certain trade possibilities. The question that opens up then is what the United States might be willing to trade for that when it comes to the principal issue of this summit, which is Ukraine. And that's what has some people worried. And it's against the backdrop, I'll be honest with you. We're even putting aside this larger agenda. There's concern about the American approach to Ukraine. I think it's important to remember that on that issue, President Trump, understandably, his priority is peace. Vladimir Putin, his priority is to win the war. And that sets up a very different set of calculations between these two leaders.
So many different angles on this, like with everything, Richard. Do you think that we should be welcoming Vladimir Putin to American soil? In an absolutist world, given what's happened, just watching on a daily basis what happens in Ukraine, and I'm not making the argument, but the argument has been made that's almost immoral to welcome this man to American soil. But then on the other hand, do you remember in previous administrations, the Obama administration would be criticized for meeting with Ahmadinejad, and they'd say, you got to talk to these people. No matter what they do, if you don't talk, then you're just saying the only option is some type of armed conflict. Where are you on this?
I think it was Yitzhak Rabin, the former leader of Israel, who once said, you have to make peace with your enemies, not with your friends. And that's when he was getting criticized for meeting with Yasser Arafat. And I think I've always thought, Joe, that diplomacy is not a favor we bestow on others. Diplomacy ought to be seen as one of the basic tools of national security. We don't want to have to turn to the military tool all the time. That said, in this case, to invite Vladimir Putin to the United States at a time when he's essentially seen by much of the world as a war criminal for his behavior in Ukraine. And by the way, since Donald Trump's been president, Putin's behavior has gotten worse, not better, in terms of his attacks on civilian targets. I'm not sure I would have given him an unconditional invite. Unless there's something we don't know, I would have been willing to do it, but only if in advance I had certain understandings with Putin to essentially justify giving him this something of a get-out-of-jail-free pass for this meeting.
And then I was thinking, it's bad to mix, economics or pragmatic rationales for dealing with something like this. But, take Syria. We had a red line in Syria where we weren't going to let anything happen. We make things that we can't stand up to anyway. If we do it absolutist, maybe the pragmatic approach and to do something which is where you just, you're not in this idealistic sort of bubble and where there are economic concerns that, they're going to be around no matter what, whether you're an idealist or not. And maybe you're just being realistic.
Fair enough. And, what we did in Syria, the calling out the red line with the Syrians in the Obama years, and then saying never mind was a disaster. The United States lost all sorts of credibility. Our reputation took a major hit. But I take your basic point, and the devil's going to be in the details. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you any agreement that involves economic trade-offs is necessarily flawed or unprincipled. But let's see where we come out in Ukraine. And I think it's essential that Russia not be rewarded for acquiring a territory by force. It would send a terrible message to them. I think the Chinese would take note and say, thank you very much. Let's now apply that to Taiwan. Right. The one thing that I think is really missing here, and again, I applaud the president's interest in peace and diplomacy, is I don't think he's setting it up right. He and the vice president have distanced the United States too much from Ukraine. And if you really want to incentivize Vladimir Putin, far more significant than any talk of secondary sanctions against India or anybody else, would be a clear commitment of American support for Ukraine. Long-term economic, military, and intelligence support, potentially different types of security assurances. That would tell Putin that more war will not give him more results, that time is not on his side. We've been unwilling to do that. And that's the biggest problem with the American strategy, even more than potential trade-offs, is we've not set the table right to pressure or incentivize Putin with pressure to give us what we want, which is that he would essentially agree to compromise.
Right. Hey, Richard, I'm going to a bit of a curveball of a question this morning, but it has a geopolitical implication, I think. Joe and I have been having a bit of a raging debate.
Really?
About the idea that the White House...
I thought you were agreeing with me.
Hold on. That the White House might take a stake in Intel, which to me is something that is relatively unprecedented for the United States government to do when it's not in a crisis. Meaning we've taken stakes in GM and Fannie and Freddie.
Are you sure it's not?
During a crisis. And the point that I've made is I wonder what this does geopolitically. We've been trying to export this brand of free market capitalism for a very long time around the world. We've been very critical of the idea of national champions when other countries have done similar things. And I wonder what you think the implications of us taking a stake in Intel could or would be to that, and what your otherwise sort of, first thoughts are as you wake up this morning hearing this news.
Andrew, I'm old enough to remember when Republicans, and I was one for 40 years, believed in small government, particularly when it came to the economy. So I've got to tell you, my comfort level is not high with all these participations, be it U.S. Steel, potentially Intel, NVIDIA, and so forth. I think it clearly makes it more difficult to us to talk the talk with others if we're not walking the walk ourselves. I also think it may make it us more of an advocate as a government for selling things, say, to China or others. And that, to me, suggests that export controls are going to be fast fading as a tool of American foreign policy. It's going to be impossible to pressure our allies not to sell certain things if we're going to want to sell them ourselves in order to get a cut for the U.S. government. So I'll be honest with you, for lots of reasons, my comfort level with this is not high.